Chapter 35 The Prisoner. On the strength of books, Napoleon expected to find St. Helena an earthly paradise, instead of meadows, woods, flowers, and fountains. He found a rock, riddled by ravines. To this rock he was to be chained, with England in the role of vulture. After staying for a month and a half at the Briars, at the beginning of December, he was transferred to Longwood. The path which led there wound between precipices 1,000 feet deep. As Napoleon ascended, the soil became more sterile, and vegetation more meager, except where there was some shelter from the terrible wind that blew from the southeast. Nothing was to be seen but brushwood and barren rock. Some 1,500 feet above sea level, on the side of the island away from the wind, extended a wide plateau covered with sickly, yellowish grass on which rickety sheep browsed. A few dwarf gum trees leant the opposite way from the blast that swept in from the sea. To the right was the dark mass of the barn, and to the left Diana's Peak. When the wind stopped blowing, a mist rose from the sea, which plunged everything and everybody into overwhelming humidity. In the midst of this landscape stood a kind of farm house, consisting of one story, with a loft above it. Beside it stood some outhouses. Such was Longwood. Here about 50 people had to find shelter in 5 barely habitable rooms. The chimneys smoked, damp oozed from the walls, and beneath the floor, almost flush with the ground, lurked an army of rats, which came out to gambol at night. Drinking water had to be fetched from a fountain 1,200 yards away. Though Napoleon was imprisoned on an island guarded by stormy seas, 2,000 leagues away from Europe, England still trembled lest he might escape, so she took her precautions. The peaks of St. Helena bristled with lookout men, raking the horizon. A squadron cruised round the island. 600 cannon were ready to open fire on any attackers. A complete garrison, amounting to nearly 3,000 officers and men, was judged necessary to deprive a single man of his freedom. But beaten, scorned, treated as a criminal though he was, Napoleon stood up to adversity. England might have chained him to a rock. Europe might have robbed him of his crown. He rose above insult and injustice. He was no rebel. He was no adventurer. And the handful of princes whom he had whipped a score of times had no right to pronounce him dethroned. He remained the emperor chosen and crowned by the French people. He had his throne from the nation, and nobody else could deprive him of it. The English had imagined that calling him General Bonaparte would suffice for the purpose. It was no such easy matter. By way of reminding them that they were still dealing with Napoleon, whose boots kings had licked, he surrounded himself with the same ceremonial as at the Tuileries. Etiquette was at once his weapon and his armor. It forced his jailers always to remember who he was. In this tumble-down house, amid dilapidated furniture and rickety chairs, he assembled the remnants of his former pomp around him, and entrenched himself behind them. The dignity of his bearing, the flash of his eyes, compensated for the sordidness of his setting, and his jailers, when they approached him, were constrained, despite themselves, to feel something like respect for him. Navarrez had been promoted to the rank of usher. When he opened the drawing-room door, everybody thrilled as in a ringing voice. He announced, "The Emperor." Napoleon's line of conduct as an outlaw was dictated by the one idea which still linked him to life. The sufferings he endured, which could end only with his death, must some day enable his son to win back the throne of France. Only my martyrdom, he declared, can now restore the throne of France to my dynasty. His attitude was Christ-like. He wanted his son to know that he had a father who always rose above his misfortunes. So in order to keep his halo intact, he was ready to bear any torture which was inflicted upon him without complaint, without lowering himself to prayer and lamentation. He thought only about his son, but he talked about him as little as possible. When he did mention his name, it was with an outburst of hope. "My son will reign for me," he said. He had asked the English for news of Marie-Louise and the King of Rome in vain. Now he knew where he stood. His son was dead to him in this world. He lived on only in his heart. Henceforth he could count only on his memory to nurture the picture that was so dear to him. But sometimes he found the burden too heavy, and for a moment he faltered. Once he pointed out to a visitor the marble bust which stood on the mantelpiece in his room. "That's my son," he said. "That's all they have left me of him." One morning, after dressing, he took from his pocket a snuff-box, on which a miniature of the King of Rome was painted. He gazed at it for some time. Then all at once he handed it to Marchand, his valet. "Lock it away," he said. "I can't have it always before my eyes. It hurts me too much." During the first few months of his captivity, Napoleon had maintained fairly good relations with Colonel Wilkes, the governor of the island. But in the month of April 1816, Wilkes was replaced by Lieutenant General Hudson Lowe, who had been carefully chosen by the English government for the job. Then things took a turn for the worse, and developed into tragedy. Hudson Lowe was a ginger-haired little man, with deep-set eyes and a pointed chin. He had a narrow, suspicious mind, and the petty, sneaking soul of the born jailer. The importance of his responsibility haunted him day and night. The idea that his prisoner might escape robbed him of his sleep and his appetite. He rushed about his island in a state of excitement, which the least incident transformed into fury. Such incidents arose within the first few weeks of his governorship. Lowe redoubled sentries, orders, and restrictions. In Europe he had once commanded a regiment of Corsicans in rebellion against France. The choice of such an officer as governor could scarcely predisposed Napoleon in his favor. Low had arrived in St. Helena with definite instructions from his government. Their secret object was to isolate Napoleon by separating him from his servants. Low's first action was to demand from all the emperor's companions a written undertaking in which they declared that they remained in St. Helena of their own free will, and that they would submit to any restrictions which might be imposed on Napoleon Bonaparte. If they refused to sign this undertaking, they would be sent to the Cape of Good Hope, and thence to Europe. One day, at the beginning of May 1816, Napoleon received a visit from Low, who came to suggest the building of additional rooms at Longwood. The governor, thinking he was doing the right thing, invited Napoleon to dinner. Napoleon, who had not invited him to sit down, spat at him. "Have you come here to torment me? Is this how you propose to treat me? It is an insult for you to invite me to dinner. It is an insult for you to call me General Bonaparte. I am the Emperor Napoleon." A month later, a piece of news brought the prisoner a little hope. The arrival of the frigate Newcastle and the Oronce was announced. These ships carried the 3 commissioners whom, by virtue of the Treaty of August 2nd, 1815, Russia, Austria, and France were authorized to send to St. Helena to satisfy themselves that Napoleon could not escape. In these travelers, Napoleon naively saw ministers from the sovereigns of Europe were accrediting to his person. Through them he could resume contact with the civilized world, and make known in what manner the English dared to treat him. He was soon to find out his mistake. The envoys had been sent only to report to their masters how the wild beast whom they feared so much was behaving in his cage. Low was his tamer, and the commissioners looked on at a respectful distance, eager to know how the beast reacted to the lash. Meanwhile, Napoleon hoped that Baron Sturmer, the Austrian commissioner, would bring him news of his wife and his son. The travelers had landed on June 18th. Some days went by, and Napoleon saw nothing of them. Then it dawned on him that Sturmer and his 2 colleagues were only additional jailers. He was prostrated. His suffering redoubled his resentment. He clenched his fist and cried, "I married the daughter of the Emperor of Austria. He begged me on his knees to marry her. He is a sovereign to whom I twice restored his states. Now he has possession of my wife and my son. Can it be that this man has sent his commissioner here without a line to me, without a single word, without even a scrap of paper to tell me that my son is still alive, without even letting me know how he is? No, there is nothing at all." Chapter 36. The Lock of Hair. It was one day towards the end of June. In other words, the depths of winter in the southern hemisphere. Night was falling. Napoleon retired to his bedroom. He felt rather tired. During the afternoon, armed with hammer and chisel, he had helped to open some cases of books, which Lady Holland had sent by the Newcastle. The arrival of cases from her was always a welcome event for the little French colony. Napoleon had shown more impatience than anybody else to find out what they contained this time. Now that his curiosity was satisfied, he was like a child soon weary of a new toy. He sat down on his couch, covered with cotton stuff. He was clad in a green cutaway coat with silver buttons, a black cravat, and white Dimitri breeches. He had put on flesh, and his complexion had gone yellow and lost its luster. A turf fire burnt behind the bars of the grate, and the atmosphere reeked of damp and smoke. Napoleon opened the Odyssey and read over again the chapter in which Homer describes the return of Ulysses to Ithaca. At one point he stopped reading, reflected, and murmured, "Yes, that's good. That's just like human nature." He listened for a few moments to the loud voices of wind and sea which merged in the sky. A storm was setting, long wood shaking. Rain drove in gusts against the little sash windows. Outside, the giant fist of the gale twisted the gum trees, like the hair of women dragged into captivity. Diana's Peak kept on splitting the clouds, which ceaselessly reformed to overwhelm it, while creeping mist rolled round its sides, like great snakes coiling round their prey to strangle it. Napoleon turned his eyes away from this desolation and fixed them on the things around him. In front of him, on a screen, hung the portrait which Gerard had painted of Marie-Louise, holding her baby in her arms. The ornate gilding of its frame clashed with the walls of the room, hung with faded yellowish nankeen, and with the poverty of the rest of the furniture. The iron bedstead which Napoleon had used during his campaign in France, the cane-seated chairs, the worn carpet, the mahogany table, the silver wash-basin, a last relic of his former greatness. On the mantelpiece, which was of wood painted grey, Marchand had placed the bust of the King of Rome, together with 2 silver candlesticks. On either side he had hung on the wall miniatures of the boy, portraits of Josephine and Madame Mère, Frederick II's alarm clock, a war trophy taken at Potsdam, and, to balance it, the watch which Napoleon, as first consul, had used during his second campaign in Italy. Napoleon returned to his reading. Through the open door he could hear his servant Ali arranging the books which Lady Holland had sent on the shelves in the study. All at once footsteps rang in the next room, and Marchand came in. His boots were muddied to his knees, and his cloak was streaming with rain. He flung it off, and revealed his tall, thin figure, clad in a green suit, trimmed with gold. "Oh, sire," he exclaimed. Shocked by this grave breach of etiquette, Napoleon looked up at his valet with a stern face. "What's the matter? What do you mean by breaking in like this?" Marchand was pale. His handsome face, with its regular features, was drawn with fatigue. He seemed breathless, as though he had been running hard. "Sire," he said, "forgive me, but I'm so excited." His eyes sparkled with the joy in his heart, like a diamond in its setting. "Well, what's it all about?" asked Napoleon. "Where have you been?" "To Jamestown, sire." "What were you doing there, in this weather? Have you gone mad?" Painfully Marchand found his breath. "Well," he began, "you know that the Austrian commissioner and his wife landed here a few days ago. I don't want to hear anything more about them." Napoleon cut in angrily. "I'm sorry, sire, but I must mention them. Baron Sturmer didn't land all by himself. Apart from his wife, he was accompanied by a young botanist by the name of Philip Well. He is officially entrusted with botanical research in the island. He is to take back to Vienna specimens of all the plants and flowers that grow here." Napoleon had closed his book. He toyed with it absent-mindedly. The actions of a rat, which showed its whiskers and one pearly black eye at the edge of a hole near the chest of drawers, between the wall and the floor, seemed to interest him more than his valet's gossip. "Come to the point, Marchand," he exclaimed, in exasperation. "I'm coming to it, sire. This fellow Well sent word to me secretly, through the medium of a man named Richard Prince, that he was entrusted with messages for me from Europe, and that he wanted me." Napoleon was suddenly shaken by some occult force. He laid down his book and stared at his servant. "Messages," he repeated. "I went to Jamestown at once, and I managed to meet Well at the Porteous Inn, where he is staying with the other members of the commissioner's party. He made a very good impression on me at once. To begin with, he gave me a letter and a silk handkerchief which Madame Gourgaud, whom he saw in Paris, asked him to convey to the general. Then he told me that he had been employed as a botanist in the gardens at Schönbrunn." "At Schönbrunn, you say? At Schönbrunn, eh?" Then Napoleon did not dare to say all he had in mind, but a gleam of spirit came into his eyes. One day his superior, Inspector Bowles, sent for him in great secrecy, handed him a little packet, and said to him, "When you get to St. Helena, give this to Monsieur Marchand. It's from his mother." Bracing himself on his clenched fist, Napoleon sat up straight on his couch. He leant towards Marchand. "Well, get on. A packet from your mother, eh? And she's with the King of Rome. She takes care of him. She sees him every day. What does she say to you?" "Sire, I opened the little packet. It contained a lock of hair and a bit of paper, on which my mother had written, 'I am sending you a lock of my hair. Send me a portrait of yourself, if you have a chance of getting one painted.'" Napoleon sank back on his couch. "So that was all." His mouth drooped bitterly. "A lock of your mother's hair, eh, Marchand? That's a delicate attention on her part. You're luckier than I am." The valet went red in the face. He stammered, "That's just the point, sire. This lock of hair. My mother is over 50. She's quite gray. But this lock." The truth dawned on Napoleon with a strength that shook him to the soul. He flung himself at Marchand. "Let me see it, be quick." He snatched the little packet from Marchand and opened it. It contained a lock of golden curly hair, soft as silk. One of the curls twined round his finger as soon as he touched it. The violence of his emotion made him close his eyes. Dear God, my son's hair, my child's hair! Tears ran down his cheeks. He raised the lock of hair to his lips. He felt the softness of it, gave it the warmth of his own blood. He glanced around him anxiously, as though some Englishman might suddenly appear and rob him of his treasure. Then he sat down on the couch again, and gazed at the curls, which made a little heap of gold in the hollow of his hand. He reflected with a clutch at his heart. This miracle, this possession of something of the substance of his son, he owed it not to Marie Louise, but to a humble, almost illiterate serving woman. He imagined all the patience, all the artifice, all the ingenuity she must have employed to get this lock of hair to him. It was not his wife who had thought about him, who had taken all this trouble for him, who had wanted to give him some consolation. It was a nurse, a servant, which of the two hearts was the larger, the more noble. That of this daughter of the people, who had hitherto meant nothing to him, or that of the Empress, to whom he had given a throne. Napoleon's delight was so intense that echoes of it came to Hudson Lowe's ears. It threw him into fits. The idea that, unknown to him, Bonaparte should have received a lock of his son's hair made him beside himself. Who had dared to break the established rules? How had this ever happened? The end of the world would have struck him as an event of smaller importance. Promptly, Lowe set his police and his spies in motion. He multiplied inquiries. He laid a complaint against Sturmer, asked that he should be reprimanded, and did not rest until he had obtained Welles's expulsion. Napoleon, who assumed that the botanist had been in contact with Marie Louise and his son in Vienna, had vainly asked to see him. When he heard that Well had gone, he sighed. A man must be a sheer barbarian when he refuses a husband and a father the consolation of talking to somebody who has recently seen his wife and laid hands on his son. Then life went on again, slow, endless, objectless, like water flowing through a pool, apparently motionless and ever reflecting a picture of the same sky, in deadly monotony. The only thing of which we have too much here is time, said Napoleon. Bertrand and Montholon were family men. They had their wives and their children. Gourgaud, whose blood was hot, went for long rides on horseback, shot partridge, stalked negresses, and attended every available dance in the hope of finding a fiancée. On holidays he went to Deadwood, where the soldiers organized sports. Of these, the most amusing was pig hunting. The soldiers got hold of a young pig, smeared its tail profusely with fat from one of its dead comrades, and then everybody ran after it. The winner was the first to get hold of it by its tail. Everybody did his best to amuse himself, though often in vain. Napoleon did not even try. He simply watched the days go by. Boredom ate into his heart like an acid. He chewed the cud of his memories. There was no hope on his horizon. Week by week, the bars of his prison hemmed him in more closely. Meanwhile, gaps were made in his entourage. In the month of December, Las Casas was expelled from the island. His departure robbed Napoleon of a valued comrade, but perhaps it was a blessing in disguise. On his return to Europe, Las Casas would stir the French army, and the courts and peoples of Europe with his story of the hateful treatment which England was inflicting on Napoleon. Now that he was not allowed to go where he liked, Napoleon had given up riding on horseback. Only a bird could ever get away from here, he said to Admiral Malcolm. I would rather have been shut up in the Tower of London than in this wretched island. I shall not live 3 years here. Already his health was failing. He had no appetite. He could not sleep. His legs swelled, and he began to suffer from his liver. To ease his pain, he took hot baths for hours at a time, in a big trough of oak lined with lead, which looked more like a coffin than a bathtub. The thought of his son was the one thing that gave him courage, his sole reason for going on living, going on struggling. He brooded over his little king above all at night. When he lay awake, changing from time to time from one bed to another, his heart was heavy for the boy. How will they bring him up? He said to Napoleon one day. With what principles will they nurture his childhood? And suppose he turns out weak-minded? Suppose he takes after the Bourbons? Napoleon suddenly stopped. He shrank from a frightful idea, which he scarcely dared to put into words. His eyes looked horrified. His voice trembled as he went on. And I've another idea which makes me shudder. Napoleon, suppose they inspire him with a horror of his father. Chapter 37. The Duke of Reichstadt. There was no denying that the life of Count Maurice de Tristan was not all roses. The education of the young prince gave his tutor enough anxiety to bring him to the verge of tears. The Count had poor health and a limited, cautious character. He was always fussing and, above all, immersed in details. He had taken his task to heart, and he exhausted himself at it. He had great odds against him. Beneath his attractive appearance, the boy hid the instincts of Napoleon. His aptitude for dissimulation and flattery, his strength of will, which whenever it seemed to weaken, did so only to spring up again and show itself firmer than ever. He was in turn scatterbrained or obstinate, indifferent or animated by a spirit of contradiction, of which nothing could get the better. In the reports which de Tristan addressed to Metternich and Marie-Louise, the tutor described all the ups and downs of the struggle which he carried on to turn the boy into a German prince. The boy gave way, pulled himself together, weakened once reclaimed his freedom again. But he was beaten in advance. The environment in which he lived absorbed him more and more day by day. It was a gradual process of sinking into quicksand. The isolation from affection in which he was kept taught him to hide his thoughts and feign indifference. People who love and are loved have open hearts, but he had nobody to cherish. He could feel no real affection around him. Above all, no woman's affection. His mother, he often thought about her, wondered why he never saw her, and asked when she was coming back. Very soon, in the summer, he was told. He was delighted, but in the month of May 1817, it was learned that Marie-Louise was not returning to Vienna this year. She was going to stay in her duchy. By way of excuse, she informed her father that she was putting off the journey until next year in order to save money for her son's benefit. The boy was told that he would not see his mother after all. She was ill and could not travel. It was only half an untruth, but the illness of the ex-empress of the French was of a particular kind. She had just given birth to a daughter. As she really needed a rest, she retired with Napoleon to Corono, her summer palace. Thence she continued to administer her duchy, with a parrot and a little monkey perched on her shoulders. They got the benefit of the words of affection which were denied to her son. Meanwhile the boy grew up under his tutor's control. Of all of them, the one he liked best was Matthew von Collin. With him he felt at home. One day, when his teacher scolded him, he replied politely, "My dear Collin, bear your troubles patiently." This teacher of aesthetics and the history of philosophy loved children and understood them. He went out of his way to amuse the prince. In fine weather, the two of them played Robinson Crusoe in the park at Schönbrunn, near the Glorietta, at the end of a somber path, in a wild setting opposite the Schneeberg. They built a kind of hut, and dug out a little cave. Here, surrounded by bows and arrows, and wooden utensils, the prince had the intoxication of imagining that he was living on a desert island. He felt remote from the world. In the solitude and the silence, memories of his babyhood and the picture of his father came back to him. So it befell that, one day in January 1818, he asked Collin, "Why was I called the King of Rome?" "Because at that time your father's empire extended to Rome." "Then did Rome belong to my father?" "No, Rome belongs to the Pope." The boy thought for a moment or two. Then he asked, "Where is he now?" "The Pope? In Rome, of course." "No, I mean my father. I believe he's in the East Indies." "Oh, no, he isn't." "Then I know where he is. He's in America." "Why should he be there?" "Then where is he really?" "I can't tell you," replied Collin, in some embarrassment. "The ladies told me once that he was in England, but that he escaped." "No, that's wrong. You know, Prince, you sometimes misunderstand people." "Oh yes, I know I do. In any case, I can give you my word of honor that your father isn't in England." But the boy pursued the subject. "I also thought I heard somebody say that he was living in poverty." Collin looked down at the boy pityingly. He realized where he might have got that idea. The German for poverty is Elend. which could be confused with St. Helena. In poverty, that isn't likely or even possible. The boy raised his head towards his master and laughed, in his relief. I didn't really think it could be true. His tutors also concerned themselves with teaching him good manners, and making him a man of the world. Sedini taught him dancing, and Ebler gave him piano lessons. He danced gracefully, with his girl cousins for partners. One day he made a false step and fell down. He got up in a rage. "That was a disgrace," he cried. It really was a disgrace. On his grandfather's birthday, in the month of October 1817, he was given a part in the Savoyards, a comedy by Kotzebue, and was a great success. All the ladies of the court vied with one another in kissing and petting him. The new Empress, Caroline Augusta, clasped him in her arms and cried, "Ach, Freundchen, du mein Schatz." During the previous year, after 7 months of widowerhood, the Emperor Francis could wait no longer. He replaced Maria Ludovica with a princess of Bavaria. Having used up 3 legal wives, he was now resolutely attacking his 4th. If Metternich could have erased the name of Napoleon from history at the price of a pound of his flesh, he would have done so. Being unable to achieve anything against the past, he directed all his vigilance towards the future. Never during his lifetime should a Napoleon ascend a throne. The Treaty of Fontainebleau had recognized Marie-Louise's son as heir to the Duchy of Parma. Metternich now definitely put an end to this outrageous claim. On June 10th, 1817, Austria signed an agreement by which on Marie-Louise's death, the Duchy of Parma was to revert to the son of the ex-queen of Etruria. Coached by Neperg, Marie-Louise showed no resentment against her son's disinheritance. She simply requested that he should be given a name and a coat of arms, so that he should be placed in the same rank as the hereditary princes of the House of Austria. She declared herself satisfied when the emperor promised to take care of the boy's future out of his personal fortune. The Duchess of Parma, in short, did not want a crown for her son. She simply wanted him to become a rich and contented private citizen of Austria. In accordance with his promise, on December 4th, 1817, the Emperor Francis assigned to his grandson certain property situated in Bohemia, and known by the name of the Bavarian Palatinate Estates. It remained to find the boy a name and a title. This was put off pending Marie-Louise's next trip to Vienna. She arrived there at the beginning of July 1818. She had asked that her son should be sent to meet her at Theresiendorf. The young prince showed great delight when he was told that he was going to see his mother again. But before he set off, he paid a visit to his grandfather. "Grandpapa," he said, "my mother is coming. Why isn't my father coming too?" "Why isn't he?" replied the emperor curtly. "You want to know why he isn't. It's because your father was naughty, and they put him in prison, and if you're naughty, they'll put you in prison too." The boy turned his eyes away to hide the anger that flashed in them. He set his teeth and took himself off without replying. As soon as she arrived in Vienna, Marie-Louise set about regularizing her son's position. The question of his title was the most delicate to decide. The emperor suggested Duke of Modling, but Metternich objected. Marie-Louise, in her turn, suggested Duke of Babenberg, but the chancellor would not hear of this either. He thought Duke of Buchstard more appropriate. Hereupon, Marie-Louise protested loudly. She was not going to look ridiculous in the eye of anybody who consulted the court almanac. She would not have her son turned into a half-baked duke. The estate of Reichstadt in Bohemia had been raised to the dignity of a duchy in the month of March 1818. The emperor and Metternich agreed on the title of Duke of Reichstadt. Marie-Louise, who knew how to content herself with little, accepted the title. Reichstadt rang well in her German ears. On July 22nd, 1818, the Emperor Francis signed 4 letters patent, which settled the status of his grandson, his duchy, his title, his arms, and his rank at court. They also imposed restrictions on the Protocol of December 4th, 1817. Franz was not to enter into possession of his Bohemian estates until the death of his mother, who was to provide for him during her lifetime. Marie-Louise was then only 27. Nevertheless, she was radiant with delight. With contentment she read over the description of her son's arms, on which figured 2 lions, stylized as leopards, and 2 sable griffins, with golden beaks, claws, and crowns. She found another subject of satisfaction. In drawing up the letters patent, the draftsman had achieved the feat of making no mention of the name of Napoleon. Throughout them the boy was described as the son of our dear daughter, Madame Marie-Louise, Archduchess of Austria, Duchess of Parma, Piacenza, and Guastella. If they had contained the expression "born of an unknown father," they could not have answered better to the secret wish of her heart. When Madame Laetitia, Napoleon's old mother, heard about this in Rome, she was exultant. "We are avenged," she said. "When the Emperor of Austria gave Marie-Louise to my son, presumably he thought that she wasn't worthy to be his wife, but merely his mistress." Once a king and son of an emperor, and then Prince of Parma, the boy now took rank after the lowest of the Austrian archdukes. He no longer had the right even to bear the title of imperial or royal highness. Nevertheless, Marie-Louise felt that she had won a victory. With an easy conscience, she went off to spend a few weeks in Baden. Then she took her son with her to the imperial castle of Persenburg on the Danube, where she spent the rest of the summer. On September 19th, she returned to her duchy, while the Duke of Reichstadt went back to Schönbrunn with a heavy heart. He was to spend another 2 years before he saw his mother again. Meanwhile, he kept on growing. By now he was a fine boy, and his health gave nobody a moment's anxiety. He was full of life and high spirits, fond of play and eager for violent exercise. In the course of the summer of 1819, his grandfather made him a present of a little gun which the archdukes had used in their childhood. The little boy of 8 went shooting just like a grown-up. In August and September, he killed 18 hares, 22 pheasant, and 2 partridge. He shot with such coolness and accuracy that the emperor marveled at him. Ist nicht verchu, he said. He's not afraid of firearms. It was at this point that Metternich scored a bullseye. The boy had almost forgotten his father's language. He had to be taught it all over again. His tutors, de Tristan and Colin, gave him French lessons. He spoke French without a foreign accent, but he took it up again with Germanic turns of phrase. Henceforth he thought in German. Chapter 38. The Death of the Eagle. Months and years went by. The outlaw on his rock had nothing to distract him but the spectacle of nature. First, the sun burnt up the grass of the meadows and brought the purple hibiscus into flower. Then the trade wind blew, laden with rain, mist, and blood-colored clouds. Next, the sun reappeared, overpowering master of the barren rock. But a day came when hurricanes from the south swallowed it up in a sea of color of ink, which merged with the sky. Finally, there were the endless months of winter, dragging along amid a stifling humidity, which mildewed woodwork, leather, and clothes, and made everything stick to one's fingers. In what could Napoleon interest himself, when he had nothing to expect from life but death, and when the dreary horizon which surrounded him linked together only days identically the same? He drained his boredom like a poison whose effect, this time, could not betray him. Yet he welcomed the smallest incident with the feeling that Providence was granting him a respite. In the month of May 1817, he learnt that a ship, the Barring, had just reached St. Helena. On board her was a sailor who had been entrusted with conveying to Napoleon a marble bust of his son. Fearing some trickery, Lowe hesitated about delivering it to Napoleon. Finally, however, he decided to do so. When he heard about Lowe's strange scruples, Napoleon gave free vent to his resentment. If he had ordered the bust to be destroyed, I would have lodged a complaint that would have made every Englishman's hair stand on end. I would have said things that would have made that fellow Lowe execrated by every mother in England as a monster in human form. At length, the packing case was brought to Longwood and opened, but then a fear assailed Napoleon. He asked Gourgaud, What decoration have they put on my son? The eagle, sire. But not the Austrian eagle, I hope. Oh no, the eagle which your Majesty yourself wears. Thus reassured, Napoleon took up the bust. He felt like clasping it in his arms. He felt like kissing it. In this stone he seemed to hold something of the flesh of his son. It was as though his fatherly love might warm it into life. The bust, he thought, made the boy look like his mother. He summoned everybody to admire it. O'Meara, the Montfaucons, the Balcombe children. It had been sent to him by a London merchant, who thought it would be a good stroke of business, but Napoleon chose to ignore the fact. His heart demanded that it should be a present from his wife, or at least that the initiative in sending it to him should have come from her. If it was Marie-Louise who sent it to me, he declared. He gazed at it in ecstasy until 8 o'clock in the evening. It made him forget his dinner. In a voice trembling with emotion, he said to O'Meara, "Look at it. Look at that face." A man who could think of destroying a face like that must be a sheer barbarian, a cruel savage. A man who would do a thing like that would be capable of committing any crime. His face was radiant with happiness and pride, but he returned to Hudson Lowe. He says that this bust isn't worth 100 louis. The man has no soul. A father could think no price too high for such a possession in circumstances like mine. In my eyes, it is worth 1,000,000 louis. He summoned Bertrand. "Send for the man who brought it, and give him 300 guineas. Little by little, Napoleon's state of health got worse. He took less and less exercise, and became more and more obese. In his bloodless face, which had assumed the hue of ochre, his eyes shone feverishly. He was afflicted with constipation, and nothing could cure it. One day he passed his hand across his stomach, and said to O'Meara, "It feels like a butcher's knife stuck in there, with the blade broken off in the wound." The swelling in his legs increased. Lowe took alarm. Suppose his prisoner should die? He declared himself ready to make concessions, but Napoleon repulsed his advances disdainfully. "My health," he said, "suffers most of all from the insults I have to endure from the man in authority here." Hereupon O'Meara quarrelled with Lowe, who accused him of siding with General Bonaparte. Finally, the governor secured O'Meara's recall, and he was ordered to leave Longwood. "The crime will be consummated all the sooner," said Napoleon. He loaded O'Meara with presents, entrusted him with various commissions, and gave him a letter of introduction to his family. In it he wrote, "If he sees my dear Louise, I beg her to let him kiss her hand." He said to O'Meara, "If you see my son, kiss him for me, and tell him never to forget that he was born a Frenchman." When the time of their parting came, at the end of July 1818, he held out his hand to the doctor. "Goodbye, O'Meara. We shall never meet again. Good luck." O'Meara was succeeded by Dr. Stocco. After various misadventures, he was hauled before a court-martial and dismissed for daring to maintain that Napoleon was ill. Henceforth Napoleon refused to see any of the doctors whom Low tried to impose on him. Life slowed down more and more at Longwood. Subject to perpetual persecution by the governor, Napoleon defended himself as best he could. More than ever, he scorned anything that had an English flavor about it. He made the most of what he had brought with him from France. He had his old green hunting coat turned, at least he said, its French cloth. His main task was to keep the peace among the members of his entourage, whose relations were becoming embittered. Gourgaud, in particular, was ready to pick a quarrel with anybody. He alleged that Napoleon enjoyed Madame de Montholon's favors, and showed himself jealous. In the month of February 1818, Gourgaud had an altercation with Montholon, and challenged him to a duel. Napoleon forbade them to fight. In a fury, Gourgaud left Longwood. At once Governor Low was down on his knees to Gourgaud, who in his rage talked recklessly. He said that his master's illness was all a pretense. He spoke of clandestine correspondence and plans for escape. The loose-tongued fellow had turned up just at the right time to support Low. The governor sent him to England by the first available ship. Little by little, Napoleon found the circle of his friends diminishing. Admiral Malcolm had gone, so had Beaucombe, and his two little daughters. February 1818 witnessed the death of Cipriani, Napoleon's butler and confidant. For lack of a Catholic priest, he had to be buried by a Protestant clergyman. At the beginning of 1819, Madame de Montholon embarked for France. Urgent financial and family affairs summoned her there. Besides, her health could not stand the climate of St. Helena any longer. In the evening of the day when she left Longwood, Napoleon said to Marchand, "Montholon, for his part, knew that he can't leave me for the next 2 years, but then you will all return to Europe. You will see your families again. Montholon will see his wife and children, and you will see your mother. I shall be dead, deserted in this desolation." Influenced by his wife, Bertrand, in his turn, asked leave to go. He pleaded the education of his children, who were growing up. Henceforth Napoleon refused to see Madame Bertrand. He kept up a deep resentment towards her, which did not weaken until just before he died. He would have been prepared to let Bertrand go, but for the fact that the departure of the parents would involve that of the children. The Bertrand children were the sole consolation left to him. There were 4 of them: Napoleon, Henry, Hortense, and Arthur, the last of whom had been born in St. Helena. Napoleon was attached to them because at their different ages they reminded him of the son about whom he spoke so seldom. He often invited them to tea, filled them with good things, and ordered Pearson, his head cook, to make candies for them. He played with them, took them for drives in his carriage, and gave them rides on Fringant and Vizier, the two horses which he had brought from France. So far as his means allowed, he overwhelmed them with toys and other presents. He got his doctor to pierce Hortense's ears, and gave her coral earrings. He got Novaros's wife to make her a riding habit. One day he realized that her dress was a disgrace. "Wait a minute, Hortense," he said. "I'll give you something out of which you can make a pretty cape." He summoned Marchand and gave him an order. The little girl subsequently went home very proud of herself, wearing over her shoulders, like a queen's mantle, a fine suit of Cirrus velvet, trimmed with golden silk. It was one of 4 suits presented to Napoleon by the city of Lyons, when he was first consul. Another time he made Napoleon Bertrand a present of a gold watch, because he knew his multiplication table best. Little Arthur, who was now 3, one day saw a fine Java pony. He longed for it, and told Napoleon so. "Come back tomorrow, when the midday gun is fired," said Napoleon, "and I'll give it to you." The boy kept the appointment promptly, but Napoleon was asleep. Marchand showed Arthur into his bedroom. The boy sat down on a stool and waited until Napoleon awakened. As soon as Napoleon opened his eyes, Arthur made a rush for him, and jabbered at him in a kind of pidgin, in which there was more English and Italian than French. "The midday gun has been fired. Where's my horse? I'm waiting for it." He was so superbly sure of himself that Napoleon promptly gave him 1,000 francs to buy it, his pony. The boy rushed off to get it, but he was not yet satisfied. His present was incomplete. "I want golden spurs," he said. "All right," replied Napoleon, "but you must ask me for them in French, then I'll give them to you." Sometimes, when he was alone with the children, Napoleon would take one of them on his knee, clasp him in his arms, lay his cheek against his own, let the child's hair caress his face, close his eyes over his memories, and weep inwardly. Sometimes, too, he looked at them with such an expression on his face that the children were afraid of him. On September 20th, 1819, a small party, which had taken 7 months to come from Rome, landed in St. Helena. It consisted of the doctor, the 2 priests, and the cook whom Napoleon had asked his family to send him. Their choice of these men did not do much credit to Cardinal Fesch and Madame Mère. Antomarchi was a doctor of no great capacity, but eaten up by ambition and with plenty to say for himself. Abbe Bonita was an elderly man threatened with apoplexy, deaf and somewhat stuttering. Vignali was a Corsican peasant, well-meaning, but lacking in education and able to speak only his own dialect. Antomarchi's arrival, however, had an immediately salutary effect. The doctor advised his patient to take more exercise. As a result, Napoleon started working in his garden and asked his entourage to help him. They made a grassy bank. They planted trees. They constructed a grotto and a pond. They brought water from Diana's Peak by conduits. Chandelier, the cook, by a masterpiece of ingenuity, managed to present his master with the unexpected spectacle of a fountain. Napoleon dug and watered in planter's costume, nankeen coat, and breeches, and a broad-brimmed straw hat. But sometimes he stopped working and looked around him with lackluster eyes. They heard him murmur, "What a desolation! What a disaster!" He soon tired of this pastime. The good it did him was only fleeting. Before long, his health grew worse again. He suffered so much that he asked Aunt Marchie whether he had not inherited cancer of the pylorus, from which his father had died. The doctor's efforts to reassure him were in vain. Little by little, life went out of him. Sometimes he stayed for 2 or 3 days in his bedroom, unshaven, clad in a dressing gown, with the neck of his nightshirt open, shod in red slippers, and with a nightcap on his head. His hair started falling out, and he dragged himself about heavily. Nothing interested him any longer, neither his work, nor the news which the papers brought him 2 or 3 months late. For that matter, he had noticed that Hudson Lowe allowed only such papers to reach him as were calculated to displease him and hurt him. In this way he learnt, one after the other, of Marat's death, Ney's execution, his sister Caroline's remarriage to MacDonald, and Madame Wawaska's remarriage, even his sweet Marie to General d'Ornano. He learnt, too, that the Treaty of June 10th had robbed his son of the inheritance of Parma, and that on July 22nd, 1818, the King of Rome had become the Duke of Reichstadt. Everything was bitterness. Everything was weariness. He had but one hope left. He never tired of repeating it. "I shall die here, but my son will reign after me." Bertrand returned to the charge, and asked for 10 months' leave to take his children to Europe. He pleaded his wife's state of health. In fact, successive miscarriages had exhausted the big, blonde, black-eyed woman. "They'll all go, my boy," Napoleon said to Marchand. "Only you will be left to close my eyes." He surrendered himself to the somnolence which beset him. He refused to let Aunt Marchie rouse him out of it. "Oh, leave me alone, doctor," he said. "I'm happy only when I'm asleep." On October 4th, 1820, he went for his last ride on horseback. He came back from it exhausted. Montholon and Bertrand had to help him up the steps of Longwood. After that he scarcely went out at all. When he did, it was in his carriage. On October 10th he had a fainting attack. Aunt Marchie wanted to blister him, but Napoleon refused. "Do you think Monsieur Lowe doesn't martyr me enough?" he said. He ended by giving way, but he was soon sorry, for Aunt Marchie, through negligence, hurt him. "A beggar in a hospital isn't treated like this," Napoleon cried. He was a difficult patient. He refused to take anything but chicken soup, and he shrank from light and noise. He asked his doctor to make a post-mortem examination of his body when he died. I want my son to know from what disease I died, so that he may take steps to avoid it. At the beginning of November, he took to vomiting. He slept restlessly, and he was always cold. During the daytime, he dragged himself into the garden. He sat down on the edge of the pond, and threw bits of bread to the fish, which he had put into it. But the fish died, one after the other. This affected him. "You see for yourself," he said to Antommarchi. "There's some spell about me. Everything I love, everything that attaches itself to me, is thereby doomed." Slowly his vitality ebbed. He was conscious that he was failing. "I'm fading away," he said. He resisted all remedies. What was the use? On December 26th, 1820, he learnt that his sister Elisa was dead. He reflected for a moment or two. A masterful woman. Then he turned to Antommarchi. "Well, doctor, she's shown me the way." The first 2 months of 1821 went by. In view of the state of Napoleon's health, Grand Marshal Bertrand had decided to stay. The patient was failing from day to day. He scarcely ever went out now, and then only in his carriage. When the wind had dropped, he came back tired and shivering. His vomiting, too, increased in frequency, and it exhausted him. The pain which tore at his side, the knife thrust, as he called it, became worse. He knew that he was dying. When he sank to his couch, he murmured, "Alas, poor me!" On March 15th, he said to Antommarchi, "Oh, doctor, how it hurts! My belly seems to be cut away. I feel that I won't last much longer." The next day, with his head sunk on his chest, he sighed, "How low have I fallen! It is an effort to raise my eyelids now. I am no longer Napoleon." At night he dragged himself from one bed to another, or for fear of the mosquitoes, he spent hours in an armchair in the darkest corner of the room. Marchand, who usually sat up with him, was at the end of his tether. Bertrand and Napoleon lent him a hand, and the three of them divided the night watch among them. Napoleon had no confidence in Antommarchi, who put no heart into his care of him. The doctor was rarely on the spot when he was wanted. He spent his time touring the island, or running after women at Jamestown. Monthlon begged Napoleon to call in another doctor. Arnault, the surgeon of the 20th Regiment, had a good reputation. Napoleon at first refused indignantly, but finally he agreed to see the doctor. Arnault arrived on April 1st. He examined his patient, and found nothing abnormal about him. Napoleon seemed to have something on his mind. "I have a sharp acute pain that seems to cut me like a razor," he said to his doctor. "Do you think my pylorus is affected? My father died of cancer of the pylorus at the age of 39. Is it hereditary?" Arnault, who was a tall, jovial fellow, going gray, reassured him. His pylorus was healthy, his liver was normal, and all that was wrong with him was constipation, which could be put right. Then the doctor took his leave. Henceforth he came every day with Antommarchi about 4 o'clock. On April 2nd, the servants said that they had seen a comet to the east. "A comet," said Napoleon. "Then my end is not far off. A comet foretold the death of Caesar." He refused to take up his quarters at New Longwood, the new residence intended for him by the English, which had been under construction for the past 5 years. "It is too late," he said. "By the time the house is finished, all I shall want is a grave." One day Arnott asked him how he felt. "Not very well, doctor," he replied. "I shall soon be giving back to the earth the bit of life that so many kings begrudged me." In the afternoons he got up, put on a dressing gown, and lay on his couch. When his sufferings became intense, hot compresses were applied to his stomach. To avoid effort he had let his beard grow, and this made him look dreadful. On April 8th, he decided to be shaved. They moved him to the window to get more light. Napoleon looked at his arms and legs. "The devil has been at my calves," he said to Montholon, with a smile. During the next few days he seemed preoccupied. He spent long periods in silence, with his eyes gazing a long way off, fixed on something which only he could see coming. He watched its approach, undismayed. On April 13th he told Montholon that he wanted to dictate to him his last will and testament. He had long since weighed all its terms in his mind, and settled them. It was for his son that he wrote this testament. His voice rose, as though to be heard all over the world, and borne on every echo of the future. "I die in the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion, in which I was born more than 50 years ago. I desire that my ashes should rest on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of the French people whom I have loved so much." Napoleon stopped for a moment. He must now speak about his wife, the wife who had betrayed him. But could he cast upon her the suspicion of her infamy, which devoured him? He could not. He could not separate the mother from the child. To asperse Marie-Louise publicly would do harm to his son. On the other hand, his love of her, his trust in her, proclaimed before the world, must forever link their twofold fate. "I have always had occasion to be well pleased with my very dear wife, Marie-Louise. I preserve till my last moment the most affectionate feelings towards her. I beg her to watch over my son, and safeguard him from the snares which still surround his childhood." Then he addressed to his son a last request, a wish which rang like a command. "I beg my son never to forget that he was born a French prince. He must never fight against France, and do anything to harm France. He must adopt my motto, everything for the French people." He went on to strike another blow at the English government, which had been false to the laws of honor in its treatment of him. "I die before my time, murdered by the English oligarchy and their hired assassin. The English people will not be slow to avenge me." Finally, he passed on to his legacies. His money, his jewels, and his other property he left to his servants, to his comrades in arms, to all those who had remained faithful to him. His son had no need of gold and jewels. He had his father's name, his father's fame. But to his son Napoleon left all his personal possessions, all the clothes he had worn, all the things he had handled. They had shared in his life. They might hand on to his son something of his vital force, his strength, his genius. The boy was to have his table silver, his camp beds, his body linen, his gray greatcoat, the blue cloak he had worn at Marengo, the sword he had carried at Austerlitz, Sobieski's saber, his gold dressing case, his snuff boxes, his sweet boxes, his medals. Bertrand and Marchand were to take charge of all these things, pending the time when they could hand them over to Napoleon's son. Navarrese was entrusted with keeping Napoleon's accoutrements and sporting guns. Saint Denis was similarly entrusted with 400 books to be selected from his library. On April 14th, Napoleon went on with his dictation. He dealt with the 200 million francs of his personal fortune and appointed Montholon, Bertrand, and Marchand executors of his will. He kept returning to the subject of his son. He requested that his executors should assemble all keepsakes, engravings, pictures, books, and medals, which might give pleasure to the boy, or be of service to him in destroying false ideas, which might have been inculcated into him. Some of these things were to be found in the possession of Constant and Roustan, who had stolen them, some in the hands of Monsieur de Turenne, and some in the lumber rooms of the Tuileries. Napoleon left keepsakes to all the members of his family except Louise. He exerted himself not to forget anybody who had served him or made sacrifices for him. On April 15th, he got Marchand to draw up an inventory of his table silver and all his personal belongings. The valet listed even his slippers. The King of Rome must not be robbed even of a pen. During the afternoon, propped up on his pillows, Napoleon started copying out his will with his own hand. He wrote industriously, but there were a score of pages to it. A sheet of cardboard served him as a writing desk. Montholon stood beside him, holding an ink bottle for him. Vomiting interrupted his task and worried him. To revive himself a little, he ate a biscuit dipped in Constance water, which Las Casas had sent him. "My boy," he said to Montholon, "it's time for me to make an end. I feel it." The next day he finished copying out his will, and dictated 2 preliminary codicils. On April 17th he dictated to Montholon the last counsels which he addressed to his son. "My son must not think of avenging my death. He should profit by it. If he proposed to recommence my wars, he would be nothing but a mimic." Then, with his eyes wide open, and sweat gathering at his temples, he prophesied, "The Bourbons will never last. All these efforts exhausted him. The night of April 17th was a trying one. He kept on vomiting. In the morning he refused to take medicine which Antommarchi urged him to take. "No," he said, "England wants me dead. I won't keep her waiting, and I can die all right without drugs." During the afternoon he was a little better. The weather was fine, and the sun was shining. Napoleon said to Marchand, "Open the door into the garden, my boy, and let me breathe God's good air." Then he sent Bertrand to pluck him a rose. He inhaled its fragrance for a long time, with his eyes closed. He felt refreshed. At midnight he asked for some fried potatoes, ate them, and had no trouble with his digestion. During the morning of April 19th he got Bertrand to read Hannibal's campaigns to him. In the course of the afternoon he spoke to Montholon about his death with serenity, almost with detachment. "My end is approaching." He talked about his companion's return to France, and the provisions they must take with them for such a long voyage. "Don't forget the sheep in the outhouses," he said. He spent a painful night. The next day, when Arnault came to visit him, the suffering he had endured had left him bristling. He made the Englishman hang his head by casting his hatred of England in his teeth once more. "Such is the hospitality of your government. I have been slowly murdered, with premeditation. You have denied me ordinary communication with my family, such as is never refused to anybody. You have let no letters, no messages reach me from Europe. My wife and even my son are dead to me. Dying on this wretched rock, I bequeath the shame of my death to the royal family of England." On April 22nd, Napoleon wrote 4 fresh codicils with his own hand. He kept on remembering people, and he did not want to overlook anybody. He bore in mind even the children of those who had served him. He asked for his jewel casket, and chose a box ornamented with cameo for Lady Holland, and a gold snuff-box for Arnault. He gave Marchand the diamond necklaces which Queen Hortense had returned to him when he left Malmaison. "Take this necklace," he said. "It is worth 200,000 francs. When you get to France, it will enable you to await the benefit of what I have left you in my will." On April 23rd he ate a little minced pheasant, and dictated his 7th codicil, in which, among other things, he left 20,000 francs to the priest who had taught him how to read. On the 26th he vomited a substance composed of blackish clots, which looked like grains of coffee. Arnault and Antommarchi glanced at one another and turned pale. It was the sign of cancer. It meant death. That night Napoleon entrusted Marchand with the original of his will. He had his manuscripts and his jewel casket taken to Montholon, and his weapons to Bertrand. He seemed satisfied, and at 11 o'clock he said to Montholon, "Well, my boy, now that I've put all my affairs so nicely in order, it would be a pity not to die, wouldn't it?" On April 28th he was moved into the drawing-room, a larger room. where he had more air. His 2 camp beds were set up, with the one on which he usually slept between the 2 windows. He refused to let himself be carried into the room. "No, no," he said, "you can carry me when I'm dead. For the time being, you need only help me." After a feverish night, he had a fairly quiet day on April 29th. He drank a great deal of water, and expressed satisfaction with an idea which had struck him. "Yes," he said, "I should like to be buried where this cool, pure water flows." On April 30th, in the morning, he had an attack of hiccups, which lasted 2 hours. His eyes strayed about the wall-paper, which was yellow with blue flowers, and came to rest on a little portrait of his son. He betrayed such suffering that Marchand took it upon himself to remove the picture. On May 1st, at 11 o'clock, Napoleon received Madame Bertrand. She sat at his bedside and sobbed. He asked her to bring Hortense to him. As the day went on, his mind wandered. He talked about imaginary things. His spirit had already left the earth. The next day he had another attack of hiccups. His stomach was swollen, and he had a raging thirst. He drank a little sugared water with wine. "That's good," he said. "That's very good." That evening, Abe Vignali came and administered the last sacrament to him. During the night he was delirious again. He called upon his son and his old comrades in arms. "Desaix, Messana! Ah, victory is ours! Quick, press home the charge, we've got them!" On May 3rd, outside his room, a consultation was held in which 2 other English doctors, Short and Mitchell, took part. It was decided to rub the patient's back with eau de cologne and administer a little calomel to him. Marchand undertook to make Napoleon swallow the drug without his knowledge, but Napoleon detected the trick. "So you're betraying me too, are you?" he said sadly. In the course of the following night, the calomel produced its effect. 8 evacuations. Napoleon's sheets had to be changed every time. At length, exhausted, the dying man complained that these changes hurt him, and his bed was left soiled. On May 4th, in the morning, he vomited a black substance again, and his hiccup reappeared. He wanted to get up, and Antomarchi had to hold him in bed by force. Then Arnott gave him a potion with a basis of ether and opium, which calmed him. All he was able to take was a little water with wine or orange juice. Outside, the trade wind rose to a gale and ravaged the plantations. When night fell, the sea could be heard thundering in the distance. The wind howled, and the house quivered like a leaf. Lying in his bed in the dark, soaked with sweat, Napoleon was in delirium. At 2 o'clock in the morning he murmured distinctly, "France, the army, my son, Josephine." They were the last words he spoke. It was the morning of May 5th. Marchand opened the Venetian shutters, and the daylight came into the room. At 7 o'clock Madame Bertrand arrived. She was followed by all the French people at Longwood. Bareheaded, they stood along the walls and watched their dying master. Napoleon had ceased to move. His arms lay outside the sheets alongside his body. His lower jaw had dropped, and his wide-open eyes had a glassy stare. Antomarchi felt his pulse. Life was ebbing. The wind had fallen. At 11 o'clock the sun pierced the mist, and in the distance the sea glimmered as far as the eye could reach. The French, in full dress uniform, went on with their vigil. Their features were drawn with fatigue, and their eyes damp with emotion. Madame Bertrand bit her handkerchief. As he gazed at his master, Marchand felt full of pain at his powerless to help him. His eyes were heavy with tears, and his lips trembled. The day dripped away, minute by minute. In the afternoon, a servant brought the Bertrand children, but little Napoleon fainted, and all of them had to be sent away again. At 3 o'clock, Antomarchi murmured, "I can't feel his pulse any more." He felt for it at the carotid artery. He put his hands on Napoleon's feet. They were icy. Napoleon's eyes had already turned up in their sockets. There was profound silence in the room. All that was heard was the gasping breath of the dying man, the murmur of Vignali's prayers in the dining room, the tick-tock of the little gilded clock, and the cooing of 2 doves with silvery wings and rosy feet, perched on the window-sill, and telling their love endlessly. It grew darker rapidly. At 5:40, the evening gun re-echoed in everybody's heart. The 2 doves flew away. The sun sank, a ball of fire, into the blood-red sea. Night fell, overwhelming everything. Its shadow fell upon Napoleon. A few minutes passed. Antomarchi bent over Napoleon. A little froth oozed from his lips. The doctor made a sign. It was all over. The time was 5:51. Madame Bertrand stopped the little clock. Marchand fetched a taper from the next room and held it up in the air. All of them gathered round Napoleon. All in a moment, death had given him back his youth, his good looks.